In this video, I'm going to discuss how to query information from the Google Ads API. Basically, how to structure your request for the information that you'd like to receive, and then what to do with that information, how you could possibly use it once you get that information back from the API. To describe a little bit of what I have on my screen here, I try to keep this code very simple, but basically what we're creating is a Google Ads client using a get service method from the Google Ads package for Python. And then we have a query where we're actually going to write out the request of what kind of information that we want. That's basically where we define the information that we'd like to get. And then here we have a variable. We're creating a variable called response that will contain all of the information that Google Ads API returns to us based on the client ID and this query that we put in as one of the parameters. The focus, however, of this video is really going to be on two aspects: on the query, how to structure the query, and what you could do with the response once the information is returned by the Google Ads API. One of the, I think, most important things to understand about this query is that, in order to how to structure it, is that the Google Ads package works on a language called GACL. This stands for Google Ads Query Language. GACL is actually very similar to SQL, which is also known as SQL, that's used for database management all over the world. So it's very similar in terms of how you structure it, but I think there are some differences that are specific to the Google Ads API because, again, the Google Ads Google developed this package specifically for their API, and so there are certain rules that need to be followed in order to request information. If you're not too familiar with databases or SQL, I think the best way that I can explain what we're doing here is if we look at the information that Google Ads has in their databases. I guess a database, the simplest way to explain it would be a database is kind of like this Excel file, and it has a lot of information in it. And within the database, we have tables, and each table is sort of like a sheet in the Excel spreadsheet. So one database that has a whole bunch of information, and then more detailed information, if you want to access it, will be contained in separate tables. I don't think it's exactly structured like this on the Google Ads side. I don't fully understand how they structured it on their side, but this is kind of just a representation, if you've never worked with these before, that what you're doing basically when you're writing this query is you're calling out to a database that Google Ads has, and you're trying to specify a specific table where that information exists, and you're basically selecting certain columns within that database, and you're saying, hey, I want to get such and such information from, let's say, this campaigns table, and I want to get the name of the campaign, I want to get the ID, the cost, etc., etc. That's basically what we're doing here. And again, of course, it's not exactly like that. It's just a visual representation I wanted to show. Now, if we look at the query itself, here what we're saying is we want to select a specific sort of column. I'm not sure if this resides as a column on, again, Google Ads database, but basically if this was just a basic SQL query, what we would be saying is we want to select a specific column from a specific table in a database, right? So in this particular case, if we look at the spreadsheet again, we could, we would be selecting this column name. Here we're defined as campaign.name from a table called campaigns, right? Well, it's singular here, campaign. So let's run this query and see what we actually get back as a return. So when we look at this response, what we can see is that the Google Ads API returns an object, and this object, and now in the response variable, will have a bunch of information in there that we requested. In this case, we just requested the campaign name. So to start to unpack it, we have to kind of dig deeper and iterate through that object and see what information we can get out of it. So to iterate through it, we will write a for loop for batch in response. Spelled that. Print batch. So what we're basically saying is that within the response object, within the object within the response variable, there will be batches of information, and now we just want to print every separate batch to kind of see what information is in there. And what I will do is I'll also print a little dashed line to kind of separate the batches and see, you know, how many batches are there just on the screen. So when I run this, what I see is that it looks like there's actually just one batch because we just see this one dotted line here, dashed line. So it's one batch that has a bunch of information in here, and we can see that the batch has attributes called results. I guess there's several results, and each result holds the campaign information. So in this particular case, we see the campaign name Hydrofacial, campaign name Emsculpt Neo, but it's all kind of stuck within these parameters called results within these brackets. So we can break it down a little bit further. What we can do is print for result in batch.results, print results. So now we're going to just try to print the information that's within each of these brackets separately, and then we'll also separate it out by a dashed line. So now let's run this. And what we see is, we see that each result is basically this attribute called campaign, where we can now see the information a little bit more closely to the top level. So before we go on further, I think it would be helpful to get a little bit more information from the API. And one of the things I think is helpful to look at is cost. And the way we can do that is we can say select metrics dot cost micros. So again, in this query, what we're doing is we're looking at a database and we're selecting different columns, right? So first we selected this column campaign.name. We just wanted the name, so we have HRT chemical peels, HRT, let's see, like Emsculpt Neo. But now we also want the cost. And Google uses something called cost micros. So it's when they return the cost to you within the API, they're returning it in 1/1,000,000th of a dollar, right? So if I have this 1 million here, what it means is this is just $1. So cost micros, that's what it means, 1/1,000,000th in millionth of dollars. So what we're going to try to do is just get, now instead of just campaign name, we're going to get cost and micros. Let's run that again. Now you see each result separated by this dashed line that we created here now gives us the name of the campaign and the associated cost, right? And this is again divisible by million to get the actual cost. Let's get a little bit more information here just to kind of see it a little bit more clearly. I'll put a comma here because we're basically saying select campaign name, select cost micros. Now let's also maybe select clicks and impressions. So we'll do select metrics.clicks, and we'll also select the column for metrics.impressions. And let's run that to see if that works. Okay, that works. And we can see again, I think the thing I'm trying to really focus on here right now is that you can see that each result in batch.results contains all the information for that campaign. So we have a campaign called chemical peels, and it returns 428 clicks, that returns this cost, and returns these impressions. And then we have a separate other result separated by this dashed line that we have here, a campaign called HRT, had a certain number of clicks, impressions, cost micros. So the way to look at it is if we look back at this database here, and if we look at, for example, this chemical peels campaign, what this result is really just a row in a database, right? It's like chemical peels. How many clicks, let's say, did it have? It had 428 clicks, and it had 6,475 impressions, and it had a cost here of this in micros, whatever that comes out to. We'll do that division later. And so we can see here that really each of these sections, each of these result sections is like a row in a database, right? And we can go a little bit, just another example. Let's look at HRT is next. This is HRT, had 534 clicks, and it had 816 impressions, and it had this cost in micros, right? So we basically, let me just get the formatting right here. We basically queried Google Ads, and it gave us a row for every campaign that was out there in that particular account, and it gave us the clicks, impressions, and cost micros. We can also add conversions in here. Dot conversions. Again, it's just, I'm going to put some random numbers in here, but the key to understanding this is that each result is like a row again in a table in a database, right? So to kind of keep it a little bit more consistent, instead of calling this for result in batch.results, we'll just call it a little bit maybe by a more realistic name of what it actually represents. So we'll say for row. For every row in this batch.results, we will print that particular row. Just run again, nothing's going to change here, but just as an example. Okay, great. So now the next thing is, it's good to print this all out, but it's not very useful because we actually want to manipulate it, right? You can see this on the Google Ads interface if you wanted to, but really what you want to do is you want to assign this information into variables so that you can use it later on in whatever calculations you're going to do. So how do we do that? How do we start taking out these little pieces of information and printing them out, let's say separately, and then maybe putting them into variables? So the first thing I'm going to do here is, instead of just printing the entire row, I'm going to start printing different pieces of that row. So I'm going to say, first thing I want to do is I want to print the campaign name. So this is going to say row.campaign.name, row.campaign.name, because we have a row. Let me highlight the whole thing. We have this row, then we have this attribute called campaign, and within it we have an item called name. Let's run that to see how that's going to look. And now you can see we only printed the campaign name because I changed this. Instead of printing the entire row, I changed it to print only the campaign name. So let's print the old way again. And let's redo this a little bit here. So Control C. So now we printed row.campaign.name. Now we want to print clicks, conversions, and costs, micros, and impressions. So the way to do that is we have to write it a little bit differently. We write print. We're still in the same row. Row.metrics in this case, because now this is the metrics, I guess, attribute, or that's what you would call it, that contains other pieces of information. You put metrics.clicks, right? Next one would be print the row metrics.conversions. Row.metrics.conversions. Next one will be cost micros, print, again, we're looking at the entire row, we're looking at metrics, and we're looking at cost micros. Metrics.cost micros. And last thing will be, we'll look at the entire row for that campaign, metrics.impressions. And we're going to separate it by a dotted line. We don't have to do it, it just makes it easier to see. So let's run it again. And again, remember how this looks here. We have the brackets, we have all the information that's been returned, but now we should just have clean information. Right, so now we have campaign name. This next item would be clicks, because that's what's next here. then we would have conversions, then we have cost metrics, impressions, and then a separated dashed line, right? Now, let's try to do one more thing before we move on, and that is cost micros is difficult to work with because it's in millions. So one thing we can do is we can just divide cost micros by 1 million, and that will give us the actual dollar amount. And here we can see, now we can actually see what the dollar amount was. So this campaign, chemical peels, had 428 clicks, 11 conversions, and the cost was 1,229, and it had 6,475 impressions. Now, of course, we could also print the labels of these two just as text, but I'm going to skip that part for now, because the next thing is, it's nice to print these, but we want to assign them to actual variables so that we can manipulate that data later on. For example, we want to put it in a spreadsheet, or we want to do something with it. So how do we assign these to variables? How do we take them out of this situation here? So the next thing to do is to place these into variables. So what I'm actually going to do is, I don't want to delete this. I will actually just rewrite it all over. Let me actually copy it over, it'll be maybe easier. And I'll comment this out just so we can have it for later in case we need it. And let's put a note here. Here what we did was we print data onto console, but here we're going to do something different. We're going to place data into variables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of these print statements. And I'm going to remove this line because we're no longer going to print to the console. We're going to actually assign all of this information into variables. So instead of print, we're going to say campaign name equals row.campaign name. So instead of printing this out into the console, it's just going to put that into a variable called campaign name. Instead of printing clicks, we're going to assign that value into a variable called clicks. Then conversions, same thing. Then cost is going to get assigned into a variable called cost, and we're dividing it by 1 million just to have the actual dollar cost. And then impressions equals row.metrics.impressions. So when we run this, we'll see that there's no actual output here because we no longer are printing it, we're putting it into variables. But just to make sure that it works, one of the things we could do is we can just now print those variables. Print campaign name, print clicks, print conversions, cost, impressions. Right, so we just assign everything to variables, and now we're just going to print it all in one line just to make sure that it's working. And we can see that we have all this data, all of these variables printing, they're being assigned information, they're printing. Now, the way that it is set up right now is you still can't really use that information, so we need to save that information somewhere. There are several ways to do that. One way is to create your own SQL database that you can have locally that you can pull that information from, and I'll go over that in a different tutorial. But for now, I want to show a simpler way that if you just want to do some quick and dirty calculations, it might be able to make it simpler for you to just take the data out and then put it in a list or something like that, and then you can work with it afterwards. So what I will do here is that first I'm going to actually create an object that will contain all of that information. So the way that I do it is I'll create a class. I'll call it campaign row, for example, right? Because I want to basically create an object that will hold information for each of these separate rows, and that way it holds the campaign name, clicks, etc. together in the same object. This, by the way, is not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. I find that taking the data and putting it into an SQL database is just more efficient longer term, especially if you're going to make your own reporting solutions for yourself, etc. But this is a simpler kind of step to do first, just to kind of learn it this way. So an object, by the way, if you're not super familiar with programming, definitely go ahead and look at some tutorials on how objects work. I think they're very powerful. They're super helpful. But a short explanation would be it's like a variable that can hold a lot more information in it. It can hold a lot more pieces of information at once that are easily accessible also, right? Because you can put information in a list, but you can make a mistake when you're coding and you can call the wrong item on the list, and then your calculations are off. An object makes it easier to hold a lot more information, and then at the same time to call that information without making too many errors, right? Just reduces chances of errors. So I'm going to create an object that would hold a row of information. So let's see, def, and within this object we're going to have information called campaign. We're going to mirror, let me actually get rid of this part here, let me delete it completely. We're going to contain the campaign name, we're going to contain clicks, we're going to contain conversions, cost, and impressions. And then we'll assign that information, self dot campaign name equals campaign name, self dot clicks equals clicks. Spelling here. Next will be conversions, self dot conversions equals conversions, self dot cost equals cost, and self dot impressions equals impressions. So basically what I did here is I created a template for an object and the information that it should hold. I didn't create a specific variable. It's really just a template. It's telling Python, hey, I want to create this kind of object that's going to contain information called campaign name, clicks, conversions, cost, and impressions. And now that I have the template of this object, what I can do is create instances of that object, unique instances that will have that information, and we can take that information and kind of pump it in there. So before I actually go ahead with it, one thing I want to show is, let me actually comment everything else out here except the object. So let me comment this out. So we're not running the Google Ads API, we're doing this. Let me create an object here called campaign1. Campaign1 equals, and I'll just create a random object with just random information. I'll call it, so it's going to be class campaign row, and I'll start putting information in there. The campaign name is going to be, let's say, chemical peels. The number of clicks will be 428. The number of conversions is going to be 11. The cost is going to be 1229. And impressions, number of impressions is going to be 6475. So this is just an example of taking this template and creating a variable, like an object, using this template that will have relevant information in there. And then, and I keep misspelling campaign, by the way, so let me fix this. This is campaign. And for example, I can create another instance of the same object, campaign 2 equals campaign row object. I'll call that HRT as the second one here, and it will have 534 clicks, it will have 37 conversions, it will have cost of 2435, it will have impressions of 8616. If I print them, print campaign 1, print campaign 2, oh, I made a simple error here, that was my mistake. So campaign 2 equals campaign row HRT. So if I print them, I should just see that they're objects, right? I don't see the information in them, but I see that I now have two objects with some information in them. So the way I can actually access all of this information here is I can use notation campaign1 dot campaign name. Then I want to print campaign1 dot what was this, clicks. Then I want to print campaign1 dot conversions. And then campaign1 dot impression dot cost and cost, and then campaign1 dot impressions. I think I made a misspelling here, maybe. Yep. Actually, I'll just print one of them to make it simpler. So here's the data that we were looking for. We assign all this data to this object, and now in order to access this same information, we can just reference that object and then the attribute. What's the campaign name for this object? What's the clicks value for this object? What's the conversions value for this object, etc., etc. So this is a manual way to do it, which nobody wants to do. Obviously, it's just an example. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take this code that we wrote right here, and we're going to build it to automatically create objects that contain all of this information. So I'm actually going to just comment this out. I'm not going to delete it in case we need it later. And I have to uncomment this. So what we're going to do is, we already assigned the data to variables. Now what we have to do is we have to go ahead and create an object instance based on this object template that will actually keep all those variables in there. So let's delete this. And now let's create an instance of an object the same way we created here. Let's create campaign. And now let's assign information to it. So it will be an object called campaign row, this template that we created here, right? Campaign row. And within it, now we have to assign information. So campaign name. By the way, when you assign information to objects, I find it better to actually state each parameter. So for example, instead of just putting down this campaign name variable as the campaign name, I want to actually state this attribute here, this parameter, and to state it explicitly, because sometimes what will happen is when you're inputting information into objects, you might accidentally transpose the numbers, right, or transpose the data. So you might, instead of campaign name, what the campaign name would go in order, right, you might accidentally put the clicks value in there. And so your object gets all screwy, you're not actually putting information in the right places. And I've made that mistake before. So I like to actually specifically declare each attribute and what information should go into that attribute. So campaign name attribute will hold the campaign name variable in this case, right? The clicks attribute, parameter, and here it's actually telling me it's called a parameter. So the clicks parameter will hold the clicks variable. The conversions parameter will hold the conversions variable that we declared here. And now we have the cost parameter holding the cost variable that we declared above. And now we'll have the impressions parameter holding the impressions variable that we declared above. And the great thing is about declaring the parameter and what value should go into it is that you don't actually have to put it in order. You can put it in whatever order you want. I think that's what makes it a little bit error proof when you do it this way. So now what's going to happen is each time it goes through a row of information, it's going to create an object based on this campaign row template, object template, and take all these variables that are taking information from the response and put them in here. So now if we run this, we shouldn't see any information. It will just give us nothing because we're not printing anything, we're not doing anything. But the issue here with this code is that every time we go through the row, we're creating this instance of a campaign row object, but then we're overriding it every single time, right? So what we really want to do is we want to create these instances of campaign objects, campaign row objects, and we want to put them in the list. And then we'll be able to actually export that information out. We'll be able to have that information to do stuff with it. So the thing we can do here is we can create a list called campaign list, and we'll just keep it empty. And now, instead of doing nothing after creating an instance of the object, we're going to append it to the list, .append campaign. So we're actually, let me just rephrase it a little bit so that it's easier to track it. Campaign object underscore. So every time we iterate through the response, we'll create, every time we get to a row, we'll assign information to all the variables, and then we'll place those variables into an object called campaign object. And then we'll add that to the campaign list. And once we're done with it, we're going to iterate through that list to print out all the campaign objects. So we'll do for I in campaign list, print I. So let's see if that works. So great. So now in this list of campaigns, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objects, each one representing a campaign row that we've seen before with the campaign, name, clicks, impressions, costs, conversions, etc. And we can kind of look at the details of it by simply saying, I wish I didn't delete the other part because now I have to rewrite it. We could print, we can look at the details by actually printing the details. So for every object that we created, we can do print. So the first one will be the campaign name, and it will be i.name, i.campaign name. Then we'll print f, what's next? Clicks, i.clicks. Then we'll print f, conversions. I.conversions. Then we'll print cost and impressions. Print cost is I.cost. It's the same thing that we did above here where we printed the object out. This one that we created as a placeholder, just to look as an example, and we printed out all of the attributes of that object. So now we're doing the same thing. We're just looping through that list that we created. So we'll go print f impressions i.impressions, and then we'll print a divider line just so we have one because it's easier to see. And let's run this again. And now you can see that you're now printing a list. You're no longer printing anything from the response object, right? Now you have your own list of all these campaign objects that we created with this object template. And within each object, you have all of this information that you wanted to store. The great thing about it is that you can now use this information without making any other API calls to do whatever calculations you want. Maybe you want to put it in a spreadsheet, maybe you want to do other things with it. There's a lot more information you can get from here. This is kind of a relatively simple query with not a ton of info. You can segment by dates, etc., which I'll cover in another video. But in this video, what I really wanted to show is, again, how do you just kind of make that API call, and how do you get the data into your own variables so that then you can do stuff with it and manipulate it.